The Buffalo Bills come up short against the Atlanta Falcons, dropping their second game in a row heading into the bye. Is now the time to panic? We'll get into that this week on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo Fanbase Podcast Network. My name is Justin, and I'm your host today, and we're kind of getting into the state of the Bills right now as we head into the bye week, and we'll talk a little bit about the Atlanta game, but honestly, you watched it, I watched it. It was a tough game to watch. Really sloppy, uninspired looking offense, and obviously the second consecutive loss. So we kind of want to look at this through the lens of where do I see the team as we head into the bye week, and two consecutive uninspired looking performances. Should we be kind of smashing the panic button on this season? And I'll give you a little spoiler alert. If you've listened to this show for any extended amount of time, you'll probably guess that we're not headed towards the panic route. And it's not to say that there aren't concerns with this team. And it's not to say that there's not things that we can be frustrated with and, concerned about as we move into, we'll call it the second half of this season. But ultimately, my goal as a fan, as somebody that, does a podcast centered around this team, somebody that lived through the drought years, you've heard me talk about it a bunch on this show, and it's just kind of going back to being able to enjoy sports. And football for me particularly is something that I just really enjoy, and I enjoy it so much that weren't very many games I missed throughout a 17-year playoff drought. And being able to enjoy a team having success and making playoff runs and all that, that's all moderately recent for myself, for most Bills fans out there. So that's the first part of it for me is I don't think we're in a spot with this team where the wheels have completely come off and, it's going to be a disaster season, and it's just going to make us miserable. I still think there's a lot of wins for this football team coming up. I do still think that we'll be making the playoffs. I do still think that we'll be in the conversation for, the 1 seed. I really do believe that all of that is still in play. And I can say all that while simultaneously telling you that, yeah, there's frustrating things on this team. There's things that they need to clean up to get to that spot. So we're going to get into some of that today, and just kind of want to look at the historical context of this team, just kind of in the sense that I think sometimes we get this feeling that with Josh Allen at the helm, there should just never be a loss. Everything should look great all the time. Things should be perfect. And honestly, it's not the case for the Bills. It's not the case for teams in the NFL. There's a reason every year the 72, whatever year it was, Dolphins team gets to celebrate because their undefeated season still goes untouched. And it's a cliche and you hear too much, but it's hard to win in the NFL. And yes, the Bills can come into this season as Super Bowl contenders. They're still going to have bumps along the way. And honestly, if we're going to have to take a couple bad L's to really look at ourselves, being the team, and figure out what we want the rest of the season to look like. I can't picture a better time for it happening. And it's not to say that I'm ever here rooting for a loss. I want to watch all the wins. They're way more fun. But, going into a bye week, hopefully being able to get some players back healthy. We have players coming back from suspension. It's something that I've talked about a lot on this show because I think this is something that doesn't typically happen, and an earlier bye week isn't something that I'm usually a fan of, but with the suspensions folded into it and bye week coming right before the trade deadline, injuries have happened, so you've gotten to take some extended looks at some of these younger players. You've gotten to really assess your roster, and you go into this bye week 4-2. Look around the league. 4-2 is it's right up there with the tops of the league. There's really no teams that are dominating in all phases right now. There's nobody that looks like a runaway favorite to win the whole thing. So I mean, you didn't put yourself into a spot where you were, say, 2-4, 1-5, and you really have to be perfect coming out of this bye week. You had some losses along the way. Things haven't looked as good as you wanted them to, and it, you're still, 4-2. Granted, you're second place in the division because the Patriots have the tiebreaker on you. But I mean, really, my expectations for the stretch run of this season still largely end up in I expect the Patriots to show some, youth and newness with new coaching staff, new, pieces to the roster, young team that hasn't really proven what they are on a big scale. I expect that through the stretch run, the Bills are going to come out of that. I still expect them to win the division, and I expect them to be in the playoffs and go on whatever run they see fit. Now, part of this for me, when I say it in the week after a loss, it comes off as like a copium of look at the injuries they're dealing with, look at the players they're missing, expecting it to come together. But this has really been my messaging since the start of the season is in particular on the defensive side of the ball, I didn't expect to see the best version of this defense. And I put it out there as like a Thanksgiving time frame. And that was before we dealt with, a whole bevy of injuries, before we've seen some other things come up. But I do still think that there's enough pieces, there's enough talent in this roster, despite having a lot of new and a lot of youth on this team. I think that there's enough pieces that things can come together. I will say that the injuries that have come into this idea have kind of made it challenging, and we look at a game like this Atlanta game, right? We're going into the game, we already have to have a Jordan Phillips call up because we have TJ Sanders on IR. Dwayne Carter already went to a season-ending IR to start the season. And then pregame warmups, Daquan Jones gets ruled out for the game. He got injured in pregame workouts. Not to mention it's, Ed Oliver's first game back from injury. Maybe the plan was to have him on a bit of a pitch count. All of a sudden, we're pretty strapped on options. You go into the game with Jordan Phillips, Deion Walker, and Ed Oliver, and Deion Walker ends up playing something like 80% of the snaps in this game and had a good game. A dude of that size, getting his first NFL action, dealing with a back injury throughout the offseason. Don't think the plan is ever really for him to be playing 80% of snaps. So looking at things like that and, TJ Sanders out with an injury, Daquan Jones out with an injury, you're missing these players that you expected to have. You take it to a step further, Matt Milano out. Terrell Bernard misses some time. You have Cole Bishop doesn't finish this game. You got stuff all over the place. And we'll move it to the cornerback room. Max Hairston, you're hopeful as you draft him in the first round. You're hopeful that he's a day one starter. We don't really end up getting to see how that camp battle is shaking out. It seemed to me like, at least to start the year, that Trey White was going to win that job. But you'd hope that, the reps come, maybe you platoon him in with Trey White a little bit. And you're hoping by this time of the season, you have an impact corner across from Christian Benford. You got that matching duo that you have for years to come. And we haven't even gotten to see that yet. We see Trey White struggle and Dorian Strong starts rotating in. And Dorian Strong was looking pretty good as he was rotating in for Trey White. What happens? He gets a neck injury. And not only do we not know what it looks like for the short term there, neck injuries, young man, that stuff's concerning for, the longevity of his career, not just, and his wellness as a person outside of football, looking at the bigger picture. So not only did he look like he was playing well, and maybe we got another late round steal here, and the conversations was already happening before we've even seen Max Hairston take the field of, is this an Elam Benford situation again? I don't know how that conversation ever starts happening because we haven't seen Hairston play a snap yet, but Strong looking promising enough that maybe we got two answers here, right? So a lot to still see there. And then as far as the safety position goes, I think Cole Bishop has had his moments that we can point to where, he's still showing his youth. He's still showing some mistakes. There's still some question there, but I think overall he's been playing relatively well. I think the question going into the season was Cole Bishop, and we didn't have a ton of concerns about Rep. Rep looks like a completely different player this season, and I think when I look to the safety position, I have more concerns there than going forward. But through all these concerns that I can put out there, I do think that there's a certain level, a certain reasonable expectation for some of this to just naturally get better as we move through the season. Now, I don't think Ogunjobi and Hoyt come back as some Pro Bowl level, blue chip talent that's going to absolutely, take over games by themselves and completely change the dynamic of this defense. But I do think that it's two veteran players that you saw, that you started envisioning roles for, that you have a plan in place for these guys being able to contribute to the defense. And when we're looking at, some of the shortcomings of the defense, Hoyt can, depending on who you ask, he was listed as a defensive tackle, an edge, a linebacker. Maybe we see that we need him to be more of a hybrid linebacker type role because of injuries that we've been dealing with on defense. And, Deion Walker looking like he's a little bit ahead of schedule. So you can change how you use that chess piece. I'm interested to see how they deploy Hoyt in this system, just with all the dynamics that are in play. I'm hopeful that Hairston comes back relatively soon. And, we have these huge questions at CB2. And he's able to come in and it's a question that's answered. Like, hey, we drafted this guy to be an answer. We haven't been able to get him on the field yet, but when he's back, he's ready to be an answer. I don't know what that's going to look like in terms of once that practice window gets open, how up to speed is he on everything? He missed a ton of reps through preseason and training camp. We've seen that be a hindrance to players in the past in McDermott defenses. I think there's a lot of unknown there, but I also think that there's a reasonable path on defense to kind of get some of these answers. As we head to the trade deadline, do I think it's unreasonable to be interested in perhaps a trade at safety or corner, or exploring the free agent market for a guy like, we'll say, Stephon Gilmore, somebody out there that you think can come in and play a little bit better than Trey White. I don't think that's unreasonable to look at as we come up to the trade deadline, and kind of take this week to assess the roster and assess the coaching staff. Should we be starting to look at Babbage? I think it's certainly fair to suggest. I think it's also fair to, as a coaching staff, want to give him a bit more leash. When has he had a full defensive unit healthy? I know these aren't problems that are unique to the Bills, but I mean, it's just a myriad of injuries, and it seems pretty consistently to be like players that you expect to be impact players on defense. That is what we've had to deal with in years past of, we're in a playoff run and the injuries just not only keep happening on the defensive side of the ball, but to like the same position groups. And I think it's a lot of the same as we kind of move into the offensive side of the ball, and kind of where I have a little bit more concerns. And this isn't to say that we haven't had players that have had injuries. Palmer goes down with an injury in this game. We didn't have Kincaid available. It just seems like the injuries being the issue is less so the case on the offensive side of the ball. And to me, kind of leads to easier, I guess, concern diagnosis, but also kind of an easier path to how can we fix this and fix it fast. And I mean, for starters, for me in this game, Kincaid not being available, I mean, it was felt. And coming off of just a great performance, granted, they, came up short in a loss to the Patriots, but Kincaid has kind of separated himself from the rest of the pass catchers in this group as being a consistent, reliable target, being a guy that's getting some separation, being the guy that you can look to when you need a bucket. And his absence was felt in this game. Now, how much would it have mattered? Not really sure. This game was, to me, first half defense getting picked apart, and in the second half, when they're able to make the stops, the offense kind of taking their turn to be the unit that doesn't look cohesive. And I think the big thing for me in this game was already missing Kincaid, and then Palmer goes down, and you're kind of forced to deal with the depth of this receiving room, and your guys that aren't really your go-to separators. You know, Elijah Moore not being able to make the most with his opportunities. Keon Coleman not being able to step up and be a difference maker when things are going wrong around you. Coleman just not able to become that difference maker, be that, true, I guess we'll call it a number one. The Bills don't like to use that, but when you're getting into, Shea versus lining up across from you, you need to find a way to be able to make an impact as Keon Coleman. I think one of the things that's been more disappointing for me thus far, um, in the offense is kind of the usage of Khalil Shakir. I think we see a ton of like behind the line of scrimmage and, short area stuff. And don't get me wrong, I think he is tremendous in that facet of the game. But I think when you're dealing with lack of separation and guys getting open, and I just don't think that the play calling is taking full advantage of Shakir's skill set, and he does have the speed to be a field stretcher. He does, possess some of those qualities to get down the field. Now, is he a guy that I think is going to consistently, you know, move him outside and he's going to consistently beat press coverage? I don't think that's necessarily his wheelhouse, but I do think in years past we've seen like the slot fade from him from time to time, and I just don't see a ton of that. I think he's a guy that you just gave a decent contract, and we can talk about how Cook just got a big payday and his usage has been up. Haven't necessarily seen the same effect from Shakir, and I do think that's part of this everybody eats philosophy and wanting to spread the ball around, all that. I understand that. I also look at it from the perspective of there still is inherently going to be a hierarchy, a pecking order formed based on performance. And I feel that the most consistent and the most sustained success with Josh Allen and in this offense from the receiving core has been Khalil Shakir. And I would like to see coming out of the bye the target share be not only numbers wise more reflective of that, but what the targets actually look like, where they're targeting, etc. I do think that we need to see about this Palmer injury. Not that Palmer was this, you know, game changing receiver for us thus far, but I do think that he was brought into this team with the idea of the skill set being the separator, a guy that can win on the boundaries and that the opposing defenses have to account for, in that intermediate and, deeper route separation, putting the defense in conflict in that way. And I think when he's out of the mix, that it creates some urgency for that receiver room. And especially in the case that Palmer and Kincaid are both have the chance of missing some time. I think that we heard McDermott talk about it, about, we should be making it easier for the quarterback. And I don't think that was really a shot at Josh Allen or necessarily even a shot at Brady. I think it was more of a commentary of maybe we could use some help in this room. And I think the silver lining here is you don't want to have to be moving picks in season to bring guys in. But I think the silver lining is you do still have that opportunity to do it. And yeah, this is going to come with a certain level of Brandon Beane having to swallow his pride and understand maybe not enough was done to address the receiver room. And, we have this infamous moment of, Beane going on WGR and defending his receiver room process and the guys they have. And, through 6 weeks, it looks like it was fair to question. I think the bright side there is Brandon Beane has had moments where he's shown the willingness to kind of swallow his pride and admit when something's not working. We saw it with, we traded for Amari Cooper last year in season, and the opportunity existed to re-sign him and not have that be a third round pick for whatever, we'll call it a 10-game rental. I don't know how many games he actually played, but there wasn't like this need to bring him back to prove that it wasn't, a wasted pick. We got something out of it for future years. it didn't work out as well as you wanted it to, and you didn't feel like you had to bring him back. There was an in-season trade for Kelvin Benjamin, and I think that one was also a third-round pick. That one didn't work out, and they moved on very quickly from that. So I think there is, I guess it would say kind of I would say a negative and a positive precedent set here, of the negative precedent being not having done enough to address it in the offseason, so you have to make moves in season to try to fix it. But also kind of the positive side of that, of being willing to be honest with your roster and what it looks like, and you have a 6-game sample size of, is this working? And I think when you look at where the receiver room is at right now, factor in some of these injuries and what it looks like, I think it's pretty easy to get to the conclusion that there's more to be desired there. We'll get into more next week, as we're, working through this bye week, about, maybe some of the trade targets, what my hopes and dreams are, what could realistically happen. We'll get into that, but just kind of looking at where this team is, and for my honest outside perspective of what my expectations could be as we head into this bye week and the trade deadline. I know it's really challenging because we put so many assets into the defense in the offseason, and I feel like we're still sitting here kind of disappointed with where the defense is at, right? I think it's easy to look at this mini roster reset trade deadline time and want to see moves made on the defensive side of the ball. My prediction is kind of cautious optimism here. Maybe we'll see a move on the defense, but I don't think the Bills are going out and making a trade for whatever. The hot name last year was Pat Surtain. Insert edge rusher here. I think for better or for worse, I don't think that they've really gotten a full look at what they wanted this defense to look like with the pieces they brought in. And, just to kind of throw all the names out there again, the TJ Sanders injury, that's your second round pick, your first round pick, both of these being positions that are still concerning. Max Hairston, haven't seen him touch the field yet. At edge, I think you are in a little bit better shape than maybe you thought you'd be. Groot was a little rough to start the season. We found out that he was playing through an injury, and the last couple games, I thought he's looked a lot better. I think Bosa, knock on wood, if we can keep him healthy, I think that he has looked the part. You've only seen a handful of snaps out of Landon Jackson, and I mean, that's concerning in itself, that he, hasn't been able to get on the field, even with, some injuries, some suspensions. But we've seen him over the last couple of weeks, and he's looked good enough to me to replace Solomon, maybe, and maybe have some upward ceiling there of just getting reps and seeing if it gets better. I think we've kind of seen enough out of Solomon, year 2, late round pick, that I'd at least be willing to dress Jackson as a swing and hope the development happens, in real time. But then you have, Deion Walker, who, like I said, has been looking pretty good, and Dorian Strong, who we'll see what happens with the injury. But I don't. It would be hard for me to see Brandon Beane wanting to make big swings with trades when we haven't really gotten an opportunity to see all the investments that they put into the defense play together. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think there's reason to be optimistic for these guys. Uh, I think there's a ton of unknown and a ton of concern that's very reasonable, but I do think that there's a chance that the play on defense is we're getting guys back from suspension that we factored into the equation. We're hopefully going to get some of these draft picks healthy and into the lineup, and we liked how that looked on paper going into the season, and we haven't really got to see it yet. So we're gonna let it play out and go from there. It's I don't know if that would be my strategy as the GM. It's kind of my own. Let me work through this whole thought process and adjust my expectations accordingly. And I this isn't to say that I can't be wrong. I think there's a very good chance that I'm wrong. But I think the tempering of expectations is still an important layer to this. I'll use the cornerback room what I think is kind of a prime example here of okay, so if you're going to make a trade, who are you bringing in? Because you have complicated dynamics here of the salary cap available right now. You have the dynamics of Christian Benford being a paid CB1 now and a first round pick that you haven't seen yet that you hope that that's your kind of cost controlled tandem. And my vision for this is Christian Benford gets back to the level we saw him last year. Hairston comes out and looks like the first round pick that you wanted him to be. And you kind of have blurred lines between who's your CB1 and CB2. And that's a great problem to have. For the 4 years, you have that cost control together, maybe even into the 5th year. So realistically, what are you targeting at quarterback? Because your hopes is that whoever you would bring in would be a placeholder until Hairston is ready. And it's a complicated dynamic. I think it's easy enough to move on from Trey and hey man, we really loved you. I don't think there's a ton of teams lining up for his services. Maybe it's a guy that you can get back to the practice squad. But who you're bringing in that you're good with the dynamics of, hey man, hopefully you're a placeholder until our rookie first round pick is ready to go. I think that's an extremely tough needle to thread. And I don't think that you're getting, we'll say this, I don't think that if the Bills trade for, say, a cornerback, it's going to be a name that's really going to change how you feel about the position group. And I feel great. Problems are fixed. Everything's good. Stay healthy, and we're good for a playoff run now. I think it's going to be more of a middle of the road move and just kind of adjusting my expectations according to that. I think it's a very similar situation in like the defensive tackle room, in the linebacker room of you have guys that you made investments in and you kinda gotta see how it plays out. And does that mean you can't make a move to add to a room? No. But are you gonna trade for Jeffrey Simmons from the Titans? Carrying like I think it's a $17 million cap hit. That's a pretty hard one to do anything with. Are you gonna trade for that contract when you have a second and a fourth round investment in guys this year? I just don't see it as very likely. I think it's more likely that we see an addition to the offensive side of the ball and, maybe you swallow your pride and can move Curtis Samuel for anything somebody will give you in return to free up that spot in move on. It seems like we get him for a game and he's hurt, and looks okay for a game, he's hurt, and uh, that's just a tough one right now. Elijah Moore had his exciting moments in the first few weeks. Talked about his role on this team, and is it a big enough impact to continue holding a roster spot for that guy? I think it's a more interesting conversation on the offensive side of the ball, and I think it's also a more realistic outcome on the offensive side of the ball. Uh, I'll kind of leave it at this with my thoughts of where the Bills are headed into the bye, and really, my goal for every game is to kind of keep perspective, and I think it was a lot easier to do and remain positive through the first 4 games than it is through the most recent 2 games, right? And kind of my thought process coming out of really each of those 4 wins is it's great to have these coachable moments. It's great to have this adversity and come out of it with a win, but there is still not a game that we've put together that all of the phases have come together. It's the offenses looked good here, defense bad there, defense made some stops, offense had to pull along, defense did their part, but the offense didn't. It's kind of been all over the place, and I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of this is still kind of coming together, and not getting too high and not getting too low in the losses. It's the Patriots game was one of the sloppiest offensive games that I've seen from a Bills offense with Josh Allen as its quarterback, and they still had a very reasonable chance of winning that game. The Atlanta game got absolutely dominated in the first half. Defense tightened up in the second half, and it was another game where there was a few mistakes from the Bills that were very big, meaningful mistakes that kind of changed the game script early and changed the dynamics of the game throughout. But as we're going into half, as bad as it was being a 1-score game, even no, in the worst moments of this, it becoming a 2-score game, and still sitting there in the fourth quarter feeling like we just need a few things to go right on offense. We need one more defensive stop, and we're talking about, could this game go to overtime? And yes, it never really felt particularly that close, but that's the team that we know in the Bills, that we have that feeling sitting on the couch that, wow, this has been really freaking terrible for the whole game. But we're not out of the realm of possibility of getting this game back on track. And I think this team has the capability of doing that in any given week. And I think the big thing that we saw from the 2 losses was the uncharacteristic mistakes, the uncharacteristic sloppy play on particularly offense that I feel is there's reasonable hope for that to get back on track. And that starts with 17. 17 can make up for a lot of issues. Maybe we go out on the deadline and get a little bit more help there. But same as I was for the first 4 wins, as I am for these 2 losses. I think there's going to be some up and downs in every season. I don't think it's ever going to be as pretty and perfect as you want it on a week-to-week basis. And I think there's very reasonable paths to seeing ways that this can kind of get cleaned up and move forward and still have a very successful season. And I can take that from a Bills perspective and then zooming out onto the whole league of who really does look like a complete dominant team, because I haven't really seen it, right? We can even take the Eagles, and not only did they win the Super Bowl last year, they have a lot of continuity year over year. Not only did they win the Super Bowl, but absolutely smacked the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. And they've just dropped 2 games. They have turmoil around the team of, should they be trading AJ Brown? All this stuff you want to hear about it. That's from your Super Bowl champions last year. You take a team like the Buccaneers dealing with all kinds of injuries and Baker Mayfield playing out of his skin. You look at the ramifications of some of these injuries, like, does that come crashing back down to earth at some point? Can they keep winning these games when they're down like something like their top 4 receivers? See, Chargers have a bad loss. Patriots look like they're up and coming, but Chiefs, Ravens dealing with holes that they put themselves in early in the season, dealing with all kinds of injuries as well. Despite how bad these 2 weeks have looked for the Bills, it hasn't really changed all that much in the landscape of the goals of winning the division or pursuing that 1 seed. Realistically, the way the whole league is going right now, it's still pretty much wide open for most teams. There's a few teams that have a pretty good understanding that it's not going to be their year. Titans already fired their coach. But in the grand scheme of the league, everything's kind of still in play. And while it feels like the sun's not going to come out tomorrow, it's going to be 2 losses going into the bye week is brutal. It's not what you want to stew on. I personally wanted the Falcons game to be a beatdown so I could just watch that game on repeat for a couple weeks. It's not how we wanted it to go, but there's still a ton of football left. We've seen teams under McDermott, under Bean, with Josh Allen have, some back-to-back losses, sitting in a bad position somewhere towards the middle of the season and be able to turn it around and beat Miami in the last week of the season to snatch the division from them. We've seen it. So, a lot worse places that we could be than sitting at 4-2 in the bye week. A lot to work on, a lot to change, possibly, and a lot of opportunity to do it. So, that's it for this week's episode. I do thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed it, like, share, subscribe, tell a friend about the show. We're going to have another episode in the bye week, kind of getting more into possible moves. We'll see when that's coming out, but hit the subscribe button. Make sure you don't miss it. We'll get into that later on. I thank you as always for joining me on this episode of the show. Talk to you next week. Until then, and as always, go Bills.